Ardennes Forest, Belgium, December 17, 1944. Late afternoon. Snow falls in slow, deliberate sheets across a narrow crossroads outside Malmedy. The sky is low and colorless. Engines idle in a line of American trucks stretching into the trees. Men stamp their boots against the cold. Rifles hang loose over heavy winter coats stiff with frost. A pair of military police step forward. They wave down a jeep marked with a white star. Inside sit 4 American soldiers. Mud on their boots, steel helmets pulled low. The driver offers a casual nod. "Where are you headed?" "Ich sind wir." The MP studies their faces. Something is off. Not their uniforms. Not their insignia. Something quieter. He leans closer. "Who won the World Series?" Silence. Snow drifts against the windshield. One soldier clears his throat. "The Yankees?" Another stares at his hands. The hesitation lasts 3 seconds. The MP expression hardens. Rifles rise. The men are ordered out of the jeep. By nightfall, dozens of similar stops will ripple across the Ardennes. Roadblocks, questions, arrests, rumors spreading faster than artillery. Because on that frozen December day, the German offensive had already begun, and the enemy was wearing American uniforms. By December 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be entering its final act. After the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, German forces had been pushed steadily eastward. Paris was liberated in August. By autumn, Allied armies stood along the German frontier. The mood inside Supreme Headquarters was cautiously confident. Yet beneath that confidence lay strain. Supply lines stretched back across France. Fuel shortages slowed armored advances. The port of Antwerp, though captured intact, remained partially unusable until the Scheldt estuary was cleared in November. Winter approached. Rain turned roads to sludge. Snow followed. Inside Germany, the situation was dire. Adolf Hitler believed only a dramatic counterstroke could alter the war's trajectory. He conceived a bold plan, a surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same terrain used in 1940 to bypass French defenses. The objective was ambitious. German forces would break through thinly held American lines, cross the Meuse River, capture Antwerp, and split British and American armies apart. The operation was codenamed Walk dem Rhein, a watch on the Rhine. Timing was critical. Poor winter weather would ground Allied aircraft, neutralizing their air superiority. Surprise would compensate for Germany's dwindling resources. The offensive would rely on speed, confusion, and shock. But Hitler wanted more than armored thrusts. He wanted chaos behind enemy lines. For that mission, he turned to a man already known for audacity, Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny had gained fame in 1943 for leading the commando raid that rescued Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity. His reputation for unconventional warfare made him the ideal choice for a new special operation. The plan was called Operation Greif, a Griffin. Skorzeny was ordered to form a special brigade composed of German soldiers fluent in English. They would wear captured American uniforms, drive captured American vehicles, penetrate Allied lines during the opening hours of the offensive. Their objectives were precise: change road signs to misdirect convoys, spread false orders, destroy fuel dumps, seize bridges over the Meuse before demolition teams could destroy them, create panic disproportionate to their numbers. Finding fluent English speakers proved difficult. Germany had far fewer than expected. Skorzeny scoured units across the Reich for anyone who had lived in America, studied abroad, or even worked as a waiter in a tourist hotel. Ultimately, only a small fraction possessed convincing language skills. Uniforms were gathered from captured stockpiles. American jeeps were repainted. Vehicles were modified to resemble U.S. equipment. Training began in secrecy. Men practiced American slang. They memorized baseball teams. They studied the structure of U.S. units. They learned how to salute, or not salute, American style, but the scale was limited. Instead of hundreds of fluent infiltrators, Skorzeny could assemble only a few dozen truly convincing operatives. Still, in war, perception can outweigh numbers. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, German artillery shattered the stillness of the Ardennes. Thousands of guns opened fire along an 80-mile front. Infantry and armored divisions surged forward through fog and snow. American units, many inexperienced, some recovering from earlier fighting, were caught off guard. Within hours, the German penetration created a bulge in Allied lines. Confusion multiplied, and somewhere inside that confusion, small groups of men in American uniforms began moving westward, not as prisoners, not as deserters, but as ghosts inside their enemy's army. Their presence would soon trigger something far larger than sabotage. By the evening of December 16, 1944, the scale of the German assault was becoming clear. Entire American regiments had been overrun. Communications were severed in multiple sectors. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, supply trucks, artillery units attempting to reposition before encirclement. Snow and fog grounded Allied aircraft, just as German planners had hoped. Then the rumors began. At first they were small, a road sign pointing west instead of east, a convoy diverted down the wrong secondary road, a supply column that never reached its assigned unit. In isolation, each incident seemed minor. But by December 17, reports filtered upward through division headquarters. Men dressed as American military police were stopping vehicles and redirecting traffic. Soldiers speaking fluent English were overheard giving conflicting instructions. A fuel dump was found abandoned after being reassigned by officers no one could later identify. The name attached to these whispers was unknown to most American soldiers, but the effect was immediate. Trust began to erode. Military police units were ordered to establish more checkpoints. Identification papers were examined more closely, insignia inspected, unit designations cross-checked, passwords changed frequently, yet fear moved faster than verification. Some reports claimed German commandos had penetrated as far as Paris. Others insisted that assassins were hunting senior Allied commanders. The most persistent rumor held that the infiltrators intended to capture or kill General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. Security around Eisenhower tightened dramatically. Access to his headquarters was restricted. Armed guards doubled. Even senior officers found themselves questioned more aggressively than before. Roadblocks multiplied across Belgium and Luxembourg. At intersections, young MP, many barely 20 years old, stood in freezing wind and falling snow, confronting drivers whose uniforms matched their own. A star on a Jeep no longer guaranteed safety. Questions became improvised tools. What's the capital of Illinois? Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Who won the 1943 World Series? The answers mattered less than the confidence with which they were given. Some genuine American soldiers failed these tests. One officer was briefly detained because he misidentified the state capital of his own home state. Another was held at gunpoint after confusing the Brooklyn Dodgers with the St. Louis Cardinals. The paranoia did not distinguish rank. General Omar Bradley was stopped and questioned by MP, who demanded baseball trivia before allowing him to pass. Even senior commanders were forced to prove their identity under suspicion of espionage. The irony was stark. Operation Greif involved only a few dozen highly trained infiltrators. Yet the rumor of hundreds spread rapidly. Psychological disruption exceeded operational damage. Several of Skorzena's men succeeded in changing road signs. A handful temporarily redirected units. Some gathered intelligence by observing troop movements from within Allied lines. But they could not seize the Meuse bridges as intended. They lacked the numbers and heavy support to accomplish such decisive objectives. Still, the damage was unfolding in another dimension. Every checkpoint slowed movement. Every interrogation delayed reinforcements. Every rumor forced commanders to divert attention. In war, time is measured in miles gained or lost. By December 18, the German armored spearheads were advancing toward key towns: Saint-Vith, Bastogne, Malmedy. American forces scrambled to reorganize defensive lines, and behind those lines, men in American uniforms were being hunted not for what they had done, but for what they might do. The battlefield was no longer defined only by terrain and firepower. It was defined by doubt, and that doubt would soon crystallize into a series of confrontations that revealed both the brilliance and the limits of Germany's most audacious deception. For the average American infantryman in the Ardennes, the winter of 1944 was already harsh enough. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow concealed mines and shell craters. The supplies moved slowly along narrow forest roads. Many units holding the line were inexperienced replacements or soldiers recuperating from earlier battles in France. Now they faced something less tangible than artillery: They faced uncertainty. Uniforms had always carried meaning. A white star on a vehicle meant reinforcement. A familiar accent meant reassurance. A nod between passing convoys meant solidarity. Operation Greif fractured that certainty. Suddenly, every encounter required scrutiny. Soldiers studied one another's shoulder patches. They listened for irregularities in speech, a hesitation, an unfamiliar inflection. They questioned directions even from apparent officers. Fatigue deepened suspicion. Men who had not slept for 30 hours stood at checkpoints deciding whether to trust the face in front of them. Some interrogations became almost surreal. An MP might ask about American movie stars. Another would demand the name of a state governor. A private from Kansas could find himself explaining the rules of baseball to prove he was not German. Mistakes carried consequences. Several genuine American soldiers were detained for hours. A few were disarmed at gunpoint until their identity could be confirmed. The line between caution and paranoia blurred. In a war defined by uniforms, identity itself had become a battlefield. For the average American infantryman in the Ardennes, the winter of 1944 was already harsh enough. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow concealed mines and shell craters. Supplies moved slowly along narrow forest roads. Many units holding the line were inexperienced replacements or soldiers recuperating from earlier battles in France. Now they faced something less tangible than artillery. They faced uncertainty. Uniforms had always carried meaning. A white star on a vehicle meant reinforcement. A familiar accent meant reassurance. A nod between passing convoys meant solidarity. Operation Greif fractured that certainty. Suddenly, every encounter required scrutiny. Soldiers studied one another's shoulder patches. They listened for irregularities in speech, a hesitation, an unfamiliar inflection. They questioned directions even from apparent officers. Fatigue deepened suspicion. Men who had not slept for 30 hours stood at checkpoints deciding whether to trust the face in front of them. Some interrogations became almost surreal. An MP might ask about American movie stars. Another would demand the name of a state governor. A private from Kansas could find himself explaining the rules of baseball to prove he was not German. Mistakes carried consequences. Several genuine American soldiers were detained for hours. A few were disarmed at gunpoint until their identity could be confirmed. The line between caution and paranoia blurred. In a war defined by uniforms, identity itself had become a battlefield. Otto Skorzeny was not commanding a large force. Despite Hitler's ambition, Operation Greif suffered from immediate limitations. Fluent English speakers were rare. Many recruits had studied English in school, but lacked conversational fluency. Some could mimic American slang only imperfectly. Skorzeny divided his men into small teams. A select group formed what became known as Panzer Brigade 150, a unit intended to spearhead infiltration using captured American equipment. However, the number of authentic U.S. vehicles available was minimal. Many German Panthers were disguised with sheet metal to resemble American Metank destroyers. The illusion was often unconvincing at close range. The true infiltrators, those operating in small squads behind American lines, relied on stealth rather than firepower. Their tasks were specific: rotate or replace directional signs at crossroads, spread false information to retreating units, cut telephone wires where possible, identify vulnerable bridges. Some succeeded briefly. A few road signs were altered, sending convoys along secondary routes. One team reportedly redirected elements of an American artillery unit, creating temporary delay, but the larger objectives proved unattainable. The Meuse River bridges remained under firm Allied control. American defensive responses stiffened quickly. The infiltrators found themselves operating in increasingly hostile territory as checkpoints multiplied. Many were captured within days. Under the laws of war, wearing an enemy uniform behind enemy lines was considered espionage. Several captured commandos were tried by U.S. military courts and executed. Skorzeny himself would later argue that his men intended to discard American uniforms before engaging in combat, a distinction debated after the war. At the time, it offered little protection to those captured. The gamble had been bold, but boldness does not always translate into decisive effect. Operation Greif was not designed to win the Battle of the Bulge alone. It was a force multiplier. German High Command understood that Allied numerical superiority could not be matched head-on for long. Instead, they sought to create disproportionate disruption. Psychological warfare can stall momentum without firing a shot. Every delayed convoy meant slower reinforcement. Every false report forced headquarters to verify information before acting. Every rumor about assassins diverted security resources. In that sense, the operation achieved partial success. American units became cautious in their movement. Officers hesitated before accepting verbal orders. Field commanders requested written confirmation more frequently. Speed, the essential element of maneuver warfare, diminished. Yet psychological operations carry risk. Once exposed, their effect can invert. By December 19, American forces had adapted. Checkpoints became systematic. Password protocols tightened. Command structures reinforced communication lines. The chaos Scorsese intended began to narrow into containment. Confusion had been introduced. Now both sides were adjusting, and the adjustment would soon test how far deception could stretch before collapsing under the weight of reality. Before the German artillery opened fire on December 16, Allied intelligence had not fully anticipated the scale of the coming blow. There were warnings. Intercepted communications hinted at German troop movements. Aerial reconnaissance observed unusual concentrations east of the Ardennes. Yet poor weather limited confirmation. Many analysts believed Germany lacked the fuel and reserves for a major offensive. Operation Greif slipped into this gap. The existence of a deception unit was not entirely unknown, but its scope was unclear. Reports of English-speaking German soldiers surfaced only after confusion had already begun. Once infiltrators were detected, intelligence officers faced a new dilemma. How many were there? Estimates varied wildly. Some field reports suggested dozens. Others inflated the number to hundreds. In the absence of clear data, commanders prepared for the worst-case scenario. The uncertainty multiplied. Counterintelligence units from the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps began rapid investigations. Captured suspects were interrogated for details about routes, targets, and strength. Yet information gathered was fragmented. The fog of war thickened. In combat, information travels through rumor before it reaches clarity. A single confirmed infiltrator could become 10 in retelling. 10 could become a hidden battalion. The German aim had never been pure destruction. It was distortion. And for several critical days, distortion shaped Allied perception. The burden of response fell largely on the U.S. military police. Young men in white helmets, marked MPs, suddenly found themselves on the front line of a different kind of battle. They erected checkpoints at crossroads, bridges, and supply depots. Vehicles were halted in long columns stretching back into the forest. Drivers were ordered out into the snow. Identification papers were examined under dim lantern light. Yet papers could be forged. Insignia could be copied. So the MP turned to culture. Questions emerged not from manuals but from instinct. What's the capital of Texas? Who plays second base for the Yankees? Who's Betty Grable? The logic was simple. An American soldier might stumble under pressure, but he would not hesitate over familiar trivia from home. These roadside interrogations were imperfect. Some real Americans were temporarily detained. One colonel reportedly gave the wrong answer about the Chicago Cubs and was held until superiors intervened. Even so, the system began to work. Captured German commandos often betrayed themselves through subtle errors. Incorrect pronunciation, outdated slang, confusion over regional details. Baseball became more than a sport. It became a password. The irony was stark. In a mechanized war of tanks and artillery, identity hinged on childhood memories of summer games. Operation Greif exposed something deeper than tactical vulnerability. It exposed how culture binds an army together. American forces in 1944 were diverse. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, immigrants from New York, ranch hands from Texas. They differed in accent, background, and experience. But they shared references. They knew the names of baseball teams. They followed popular radio programs. They understood slang that shifted by region yet remained recognizably American. German planners attempted to replicate this familiarity. Some infiltrators studied American films. Others memorized team rosters. A few had lived briefly in the United States before the war. Yet culture is not memorized easily. It is absorbed over years. Under questioning, small cracks appeared, a hesitation over a sports result, a mispronounced city, an unfamiliar idiom. The deception faltered not because of uniforms, but because of identity. At the same time, suspicion left scars. American soldiers began questioning even each other's accents. A Midwesterner might eye a Southerner warily. An unfamiliar dialect could invite interrogation. The operation designed to fracture Allied coordination had also tested the resilience of American cohesion. By December 20, the infiltrators were increasingly cornered. Many had been captured. Others were isolated without support. The shock they generated had reached its peak. Now the broader German offensive surged forward, armored columns pushing toward critical road junctions. The psychological battle had set the stage, but the fate of the Ardennes would be decided not at checkpoints, but in the crucible of advancing panzers and desperate American resistance. By December 18, the German offensive had torn a deep wound into the American front. Columns from the 6th Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich pushed westward along icy roads. To the south, the 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel advanced with alarming speed toward St. Vith-en-Bastogne. The Ardennes, dense and snowbound, became a funnel of steel. American units fell back under pressure. At St. Vith, defenders struggled to hold key road junctions. Near Malmedy, confusion compounded tragedy as scattered engagements intensified. Southward, armored spearheads probed the Meuse River, the operational objective that would determine whether the German gamble succeeded. Behind the shifting front, Operation Greif reached its decisive moment. On December 18, reports of infiltrators multiplied. Military police checkpoints expanded into layered security grids. Every major crossroads west of the German advance became a choke point. Engineers, signal units, artillery columns, all were halted and questioned. The scene repeated across Belgium. A jeep approached. It bore correct markings. The driver wore the right rank insignia. His vehicle registration appeared legitimate. But legitimacy now required proof beyond fabric and paint. A name the capital, Ohio. Who was the vice president before the war? Which league do the Chicago Cubs play in? These were not formal interrogation manuals. They were improvised filters. Cultural recognition as authentication. The pressure worked both ways. Several American soldiers, exhausted and frostbitten, stumbled over answers. One officer reportedly insisted that the capital of Illinois was Chicago. He was detained until verification arrived. Another was challenged over the year the Brooklyn Dodgers last won the National League pennant. He guessed incorrectly. Rifles rose. The paranoia reached senior levels. General Omar Bradley was stopped and asked baseball questions. He answered correctly. Others were less fortunate. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced tightened security. Rumors that German commandos intended to assassinate him forced his temporary confinement within headquarters. Access required layers of verification. The supreme Allied commander of Western Europe was, for a brief period, effectively isolated by suspicion. The irony was profound. Operation Greif had deployed fewer than 50 fully fluent English-speaking commandos. Yet Allied countermeasures assumed a far greater threat. And still, some infiltrators achieved temporary success. A team reportedly reversed road signs near Hansfeld, misdirecting supply trucks. Another group diverted traffic away from threatened sectors, delaying reinforcement. A few penetrated deep enough to observe troop movements and relay intelligence, but the larger mission, seizing bridges across the Meuse, remained out of reach. Panzer Brigade 150, the armored element of Skorzena's operation, encountered immediate limitations. Many of its vehicles, German Panthers disguised as American Manten tank destroyers, were identified at closer inspection. The deception held at distance but failed under scrutiny. Fuel shortages compounded the issue. German armored units advanced rapidly but strained logistics. The offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel depots intact. Time was narrowing. By December 19, American resistance stiffened at critical nodes. At Bastogne, the elements of the 101st Airborne Division began organizing defensive positions. At St. Vith, battered units regrouped to slow German progress. Artillery concentrations increased. Engineers prepared demolitions at key bridges. The psychological shock of the first 48 hours was fading. In its place came structured response. Captured infiltrators were brought to improvised detention centers. Interrogations revealed the scope of Operation Greif. The number of operatives was smaller than feared. Their objectives were ambitious but limited by manpower. Under the laws of war, the situation was clear. Wearing enemy uniforms behind the lines constituted espionage. Several captured commandos were tried by U.S. military tribunals in the following days. Some were executed. As word spread that infiltrators were being caught and punished, American morale steadied. Roadblocks became more efficient, questions more pointed, verification faster. The deception that had sown confusion now triggered discipline. Meanwhile, at the front, the German advance slowed under mounting resistance and logistical strain. Snow continued to fall. Visibility remained poor, but American commanders were regaining coordination. The bulge in the line had grown, yet it had not broken through. And as December 20 approached, the fate of the offensive, and of Operation Greif itself, hung on whether German armored columns could reach the Meuse before Allied forces closed the breach. December 21, 1944. The German advance had reached its deepest penetration. Armored spearheads pressed westward through narrow forest roads, aiming for crossings over the Meuse River. If those bridges fell intact, the path toward Antwerp would open. Allied armies could be split. The Western Front might fracture. But the timetable was collapsing. Fuel shortages tightened around German columns like a vice. Many panzers had advanced farther than supply lines could sustain. Some crews siphoned gasoline from abandoned American vehicles. Others simply stopped where they stood, engines silent in the snow. Panzer Brigade 150, scores in this formation, attempted to push forward near Malmedy and Ligneville. Its disguised vehicles encountered American resistance almost immediately. At close range, the deception faltered. Details did not align, silhouettes betrayed German design. Engagement followed identification. The brigade failed to achieve a breakthrough. Meanwhile, American forces were stabilizing critical road junctions. At Bastogne, surrounded but unbroken, the 101st Airborne Division fortified its perimeter. Artillery units coordinated defensive fire. Medical stations filled with wounded as temperatures dropped below freezing. German demands for surrender were rejected. At Saint-Beuve, delaying action slowed the German timetable further. Each hour gained allowed reinforcements to arrive from other sectors. And then the weather shifted. On December 23, the overcast skies began to clear. For nearly a week, fog and snow had shielded German movements from Allied air power. Now the clouds parted. Blue sky appeared over the Ardennes. American and British aircraft surged into the air. Fighter bombers targeted German supply columns. Bridges were struck. Fuel trucks burned along forest roads. The Luftwaffe, weakened and outnumbered, could not contest the skies effectively. The balance tilted. Operation Greif, already unraveling, lost its remaining strategic relevance. Most infiltrators had been captured or withdrawn. The psychological shock they created had faded into procedural caution. American checkpoints remained, but panic had subsided. Captured commandos were interrogated in detail. They confirmed that their numbers were small. Their success had depended more on rumor than action. Some were tried swiftly by U.S. military courts. Under the laws of armed conflict at the time, soldiers captured wearing enemy uniforms behind lines could be treated as spies. Several were executed by firing squad in late December 1944. Otto Skorzeny himself withdrew with surviving elements of his unit as the offensive faltered. His broader mission, to seize Meuse bridges and paralyze Allied command, had not materialized. By December 24-25, German momentum slowed to a crawl. The offensive had created a salient, the Bulge, but not a breakthrough. Allied forces converged from north and south, compressing the protrusion. General George S. Patton's Third Army pivoted northward in a rapid maneuver to relieve Bastogne. Coordination improved daily. What had begun as a surprise offensive was becoming a battle of attrition Germany could not win. Operation Greif had demonstrated ingenuity and boldness. It had momentarily shaken Allied confidence. It had forced an army to question itself. But it had not altered the outcome. By early January 1945, German forces began withdrawing from the Ardennes. Casualties were severe, equipment losses irreplaceable. The last major German offensive in the West had failed. the winter forest returned to silence broken only by distant artillery and the crackle of burning wreckage. The deception was over, the bulge was shrinking, and what remained was the cost, in lives, in material, and in the fragile certainty that a uniform once guaranteed. By early January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had exhausted itself. German forces, battered and undersupplied, began a gradual withdrawal to positions closer to the Siegfried Line. The Bulge and the Allied front receded under coordinated counterattacks from north and south. What remained in the snow-covered forest were wrecked vehicles, frozen bodies, and the quiet arithmetic of loss. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. American casualties exceeded 80,000, killed, wounded, and missing. German losses were comparable, with irreplaceable armored divisions shattered, tanks abandoned for lack of fuel dotted forest roads. Artillery pieces lay overturned in ditches. Operation Greif, in contrast, had been numerically small. Fewer than 100 German soldiers operated in American uniforms behind Allied lines. Of these, many were captured within days. Several were executed after military tribunals determined they had engaged in espionage under the laws of war. Others were imprisoned until the war's end. The executions were controversial even at the time. Wearing an enemy uniform during infiltration blurred legal boundaries. Scoresny later argued that his men had intended to remove American uniforms before engaging in combat, claiming their mission was reconnaissance and sabotage rather than direct fighting. After the war, during the Dachau trials in 1947, Scoresny was acquitted of war crimes charges related to improper use of enemy uniforms, partly because Allied forces themselves had used similar deception tactics in limited circumstances. But in December 1944, legal nuance gave way to battlefield law. Captured infiltrators were treated as spies. For American forces, the immediate lesson was procedural. Identification protocols tightened permanently. Password systems became more rigorous. Unit movements required clearer documentation. The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps expanded investigative measures in combat zones. Security around senior commanders remained heightened for weeks. Eisenhower's temporary confinement during the height of infiltration rumors underscored how deeply the deception had penetrated Allied psychology. Yet the broader strategic outcome was unchanged. The German offensive had failed to reach the Meuse. Antwerp remained secure. Allied armies retained cohesion. When the weather cleared, air superiority reasserted itself decisively. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. The Ardennes offensive consumed reserves that could not be replaced. Experienced panzer crews were lost. Fuel stocks were depleted beyond recovery. The Luftwaffe suffered further attrition attempting to support ground operations. Operation Greif had achieved disruption, but not decision. Its greatest effect had been intangible. For several days, an entire army doubted its own reflections. Roadblocks had multiplied. Questions had replaced trust. Cultural familiarity had become a weapon and a shield. But once exposed, the deception hardened Allied resolve rather than fractured it. The final German gamble in the West had not only failed, it had accelerated exhaustion. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes salient had been erased. American and British forces re-established the line largely where it stood before December 16. Snow still covered the forests, but the momentum had shifted permanently. The German army in the West had spent its final reserves. The human cost was staggering. The United States suffered over 19,000 killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge, with tens of thousands more wounded or captured. It was the deadliest battle ever fought by American forces in the war. German casualties were similarly severe. Estimates range from 70,000 to over 100,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Crucially, many of those losses were among veteran units Germany could not replace. Armored divisions that had once spearheaded blitzkrieg across Europe were now shadows of their former strength. Operation Greif, the reckoning was quieter but symbolically powerful. Most infiltrators had been neutralized within the first week of the offensive. Their limited tactical disruptions did not alter the operational outcome. The bridges over the Meuse remained in Allied hands. The assassination rumors proved unfounded. No decisive sabotage occurred, yet the operation left a psychological imprint disproportionate to its scale. American soldiers remembered the roadblocks long after the battle ended. The image of MP demanding baseball trivia in a frozen forest became part of the war's folklore. Not because it was theatrical, but because it was real. The incident reinforced several enduring military lessons. Deception can multiply fear beyond physical damage. Rumor can move faster than armor. Trust, once shaken, requires structure to restore. For Allied command, the battle confirmed both vulnerability and resilience. The surprise of December 16 revealed intelligence blind spots. German forces had achieved operational surprise despite signs of buildup. Weather had neutralized Allied air advantage at a critical moment. Overconfidence after rapid advances across France had contributed to thinly held defensive sectors in the Ardennes, but the response demonstrated adaptability. Within days, reinforcements were redirected, defensive lines solidified. Commanders coordinated across army groups. When skies cleared, air power returned with overwhelming effect. Logistics recovered. Discipline replaced alarm. The German High Command had hoped the offensive would fracture Allied political unity, potentially driving a wedge between American and British leadership. Instead, the opposite occurred. The crisis reinforced coordination. The line held. For Germany, the failure marked the end of large-scale offensive capability in the West. After January 1945, German forces would fight defensively on two collapsing fronts, the Soviets advancing from the east, the Allies pressing from the west. The Ardennes was the last throw of the dice. Operation Greif, bold and imaginative, became a footnote within that final gamble, a reminder that ingenuity cannot compensate indefinitely for strategic exhaustion. As Allied armies pushed toward the Rhine in February and March 1945, the memory of infiltrators faded into routine security procedure. Checkpoints remained, but panic did not return. The war's trajectory was irreversible, and yet in quiet moments, soldiers would still recall that week in December when a simple question, about baseball, about home, determined whether a man lived as comrade or stood accused as enemy. Because in the Ardennes, identity had briefly become as decisive as artillery. And in that realization lay the deeper meaning of the episode. In December 1944, the war in Europe was measured in miles of forest and columns of armor. But for a few frozen days in the Ardennes, it was measured in something smaller. A question. Operation Greif did not change the outcome of the war. It did not capture Antwerp. It did not split Allied armies. Its infiltrators were too few, its objectives too ambitious, its timing too fragile against fuel shortages and air power. Yet it revealed a truth about modern warfare. Battles are not fought only with tanks and artillery. They are fought with perception, with doubt, with identity. A uniform is meant to signal belonging. It tells a soldier who stands beside him. In the Ardennes, that certainty fractured. American soldiers studied one another's faces in the snow. They asked about baseball teams, state capitals, radio stars, fragments of home carried into war. Culture became authentication. Trust became conditional. And when the deception was exposed, discipline restored what suspicion had shaken. Roadblocks became orderly. Intelligence sharpened, command adapted. The offensive stalled. The episode remains a reminder that even in mechanized industrial war, the human element endures. Accent memory, shared experience, these cannot be replicated easily by an enemy. The winter of 1944 showed how fragile certainty can be. It also showed how resilient it can become once tested. Because in the end, the line in the Ardennes did not hold due to a baseball question. It held because an army, shaken but unbroken, chose to steady itself and move forward through the snow.